So another problem, anti-quality factor that we see is prussic acid. And this is only in certain species. So some of our sorghum Sudan, some of our sorghum species. Do you guys have Johnson grass? Yeah, okay. Johnson grass is notorious for it as well. They contain this cyanogenic glycosides that releases hydrocyanic acid, pretty much does very similar to what nitrate toxicity does. This usually happens when that plant is stressed or right after a frost. Okay, so if that plant was to get frosted and then you go out there and graze it or cut it, you can run into some prussic acid problems. Same thing in black cherry trees. That's why, we warn livestock folks about having wild cherry trees in their pastures. It's not the live flourishing cherry tree that's the problem, but if a limb was to fall off or the tree was to fall down and those leaves begin to wilt, that's when they have prussic acid in them and can cause some problems. Okay. And then fescue, y'all are still in fescue belt. Okay, all right, we won't harp on fescue toxicosis. It's probably more so up in my neck of the woods, but it too can cause a problem. There's this ergot that lives in the fescue, and so it can cause some reduced animal performance, but there's ways to work around it as well. Okay, let's move on. All right, so thou shalt test your forages. We're going to hear that again. We're going to really encourage you to test your forages. Okay, so we've talked about the forage test and what that looks like and how we're going to, what does high quality look like? What are, we know what our goal is of this good RFQ, low fiber content, high energy content. So now let's talk about how we're going to get there. Like, how do we do that? Like, that sounds great. But it's not always this easy goal to obtain. And so let's look at some of those primary factors that affect forage quality. And I want you to remember these because when Shanna comes and talks about hay production next weekend, she's going to talk about, preserving that hay, and we'll lead back into some of what we're going to talk about tonight. So number one, the primary factor that affects forage quality is plant maturity. Okay? number one, if you do nothing else, cutting that forage at the right time or even grazing it at the right time will be of higher quality. So Bermuda grasses should be every 4 to 5 weeks, tall fescue in the boot or early head stage. And what we're talking about is kind of that same paradox, right? So we have our days of growth down here on our bottom axis, digestibility and palatability. So what happens as that plant matures? It puts on more fiber, that cell wall gets thicker. And as that happens, our fiber goes up, and then our digestibility and our palatability go down. So, just stage of maturity, when I used to give this in North Georgia, everybody asked, what's a boot stage? So I included this to kind of give an example, but your boot is going to be, somewhere in here before, right as that head starts to develop rolled up inside of that plant. That's a boot stage. So why this is important, so let's look at a couple of different maturity levels for Bermuda grass. So here's Bermuda grass that's cut at 4, 6, and 8 weeks. You notice that, boom, our 4-week, and these supplement prices are really old, take them as a relative, not as what it currently costs. But, as that grass matures, all of our quality goes lower, and when that happens, we have to supplement. So it costs us more, okay? So again, early harvested forage, lots of good stuff in the middle of that cell wall. Our cell wall is thinner, less fibrous. Our late harvested forages, thick cell wall, higher NDF, higher ADF in those plants. So I always thought this was a very good visual. So here again, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. We're going to look at our tons per acre that we're producing. The green bar is going to be digestible dry matter. The brown bar is undigestible. So here's our 4-week bar, 6-week, 8 weeks. Yes, at 8 weeks, I got 2.5 tons. That's great. Do you see that half of it come out of the other side of the cow is manure? It didn't do me any good, right? So I'm not really producing any more digestible forage. All I'm doing is getting more poop. And that's no fun. Okay? Just more manure. All right, we'll avoid, the tall fescue does the same thing. Okay, so our harvest timing recommendations for our forages. Hybrid media grasses, our first cutting should be at 12 to 16 inches. Our subsequent cutting should be at 3.5 to 5 weeks. I realize that rainfall and what's going on is going to influence that dramatically, but we can strive for it. Okay, that's a goal. Tall fescue, ryegrass, orchard grass, mid to late boot. Subsequent cuttings at 10 to 12. Some of our small grains. So there are 2 opportunities to harvest our small grains, including the boot stage, which is going to be your highest quality, or the dough stage. Usually only 1 harvest is possible with most of these. You're not going to get enough regrowth to get us another one. And then any of our alfalfas, we're going to spring cut at 10 to 20% blooming, and then cut at late bud, which is a 10% bloom for subsequent. Okay? Again, boot stage. I had a lot of questions. This is what boot stage, you see just the bare little bit of that seed head starting to poke out there. Okay, our second factor that's going to affect forage quality is the forage species. We realize that sometimes we don't have an option of what forage species we have. We have whatever we inherited or we put in however long ago. If you do get the option to change out, you're wanting to renovate a pasture or a hay field, choose something with high quality, right? So we have a lot of options out there. Again, our tropical or warm season perennial and annual grasses that we're accustomed to are kind of down here on the bottom. Our legumes get up into our higher quality forage species. And we looked at that chart. Okay, number 3, bale storage. So protecting our harvested forages from rainfall and weather during storage can really affect our forage quality, okay? Now, we are not all blessed with the money for a hay barn. We never have been, but there are other tools and tricks you can use to help preserve that forage, because we've all seen bales that look like this all the time. And when hay gets short, sometimes we have to feed bales that look like this. But realize that in this 14 inches of this hay bale, there is 74% of the volume of that bale. So that amount of weather that we've lost because of how this bale was stored or how it was taken care of, is contained in that 14 inches that we're not going to be able to utilize to feed our cows with. Okay? So, things we need to think about. Same thing here. Average spoilage depth in bale diameter. So, you see right there, 4 inches on a 3-foot bale is 40%, etc. So it could be pretty significant losses from weathering damage. So here's some hay storage research out of Kentucky, and Shanna might mention some of this stuff again. I'm not sure how much of this overlaps. But what I do want you to pay attention to, yes, shed is the best. If you're able to get it out of the weather into a barn, that is the goal. But some of us can't reach that goal, so we're going to, twine bale, you're going to lose a whole lot more than net wrapped than solid plastic. Okay? So even your net wrapped bales, you're able to protect that bale pretty well from the weather. And there's other things that we can do with those. You can get creative. We have certainly stored some bales like this before, just with some tarps over them, just to protect them from the weather. We ended up being able to purchase some really high quality hay. We got it up off the ground and we threw some tarps on it just to protect as much of those bales as we could to be able to utilize it. I'm sure Shannon, this is in the hay talk next week too, so she's probably going to go over a lot of other options as well, but positioning those bales properly when you row them to maximize sun exposure, pressing them up against each other, anything you can do to get them up off the ground, all of that is going to save those bales from that weathering. Okay, our fourth factor is rain during curing. So avoiding cutting if there is significant rainfall, we're going to consider over 1/2 inch significant rainfall on that hay when it's on the ground. So is the risk of rain damage overblown? Sometimes it is, okay? So we talked about maturity being really, really important. And so if we wait and we let that grass mature, waiting for it to not have a chance of rain, which, you know, all of summer is about 30%, right? You never really know what it's going to do. But every day after 4 weeks that we wait to harvest that hay, we're going to drop about 0.5% TDN, okay? So every day we're waiting and letting that forage get mature, we're losing energy. If we wait a week to delay and avoid 1/2 inch of rain, we're going to drop 3.5% TDN. But if we had just harvested and let that hay get rained on and it was just 1/2 inch, I'm only going to drop 1 TDN, 1%. Okay? So over 1/2 inch, you start losing more significantly, but if it's just a sprinkle coming along, it's better off to go ahead and cut it and then work on drying it out than it is to wait. Okay? So here's a good chart to demonstrate that. So here's your rainfall inches at the bottom. Our Bermuda grass is this green line, orchard grass is the blue one, but you see really past 1.5 inches it doesn't really, I mean like it's the same, about 2%, a little over 2% TDN, okay? That's lost due to rainfall. Again, same thing on our tall fescue hay, no rain versus rain damage. Okay, moisture at baling. So we want to make sure that our bales, our preserved forages are at the right moisture. And we're talking about dry hay right now. Shannon will get into baleage a little bit next week about proper moisture when we put it up. But we want to be sure we allow that forage to dry. So rounds somewhere around 15%, our squares somewhere around 18%. And the way that we manage that moisture is we're going to cut it at the right time to maximize our drying time. We're going to allow that swath to be spread wide enough so that it gets good drying. We're going to use a tedder, or we could ted in the morning of the next day if needed. And I say morning, it's usually good to start tedding when there's just a little dew on it because it prevents leaf damage on that plant. You want to really watch that leaf shatter. And again, there's our target moisture on those bales. She'll get into this a lot more as well, but this is really going to affect our forage quality because if we put it up too wet, what could happen? Mold, spontaneous combustion. There's a lot of bad things that happen when hay gets put up too wet. Okay, variety. So varieties within forage species are proven to have higher quality, and so this goes within, so let's just talk Bermuda grasses really quickly. We all, there are Bermuda grasses that have the potential to be higher forage quality than others. For example, our Tift 85 and Russell Bermuda grass is probably on the higher end of them. Everybody has a preference on what they like. Now, Bermuda grass stem maggot, which I know you guys have talked about already, probably he's going to start playing a lot into what you choose, because if you plant Alicia, it's probably going to get eat up with stem maggot. It really likes those finer stemmed Bermuda grasses. But I've seen some really great hay come off of just some common and coastal fields. If it's preserved right and at the right maturity level, it has the potential to be a pretty good quality forage. But if you had a choice, you would probably, if you were choosing a Bermuda grass, I would suggest choosing one of higher quality. And last, but certainly not least, in our primary factors, which a lot of people would probably think would be the main factor to affect forage quality, is fertilization. And it really does have the least amount of all of those things affect. Now, does it affect forage quality? Sure. It also, it's going to affect the yield, it's going to affect the plant health. And when I say fertilization, I'm mostly talking about nitrogen. It's also really important, don't forget P and K when we're putting fertilization out, because that's really going to affect your plant health and its ability to withstand pest and disease pressure. But nitrogen, you can't just bump up nitrogen and affect forage quality, because you can have really crappy hay that was fertilized really well. So here are two nitrogen levels, right? So our green line is 50 pounds of nitrogen, our blue line is 200 pounds of nitrogen, but you see, even as our harvest date extends, it doesn't really matter. Those are all going down, right? Our crude protein and our, well, crude protein and our digestibility just continues to go down because we're getting too mature, okay? All right, what y'all think? These goals that we can attain or reach for, certainly some of these things we might not have control over, right? Forage species and variety, you might be stuck with whatever you got. You got to work with what you have, but certainly cutting at the right time and influence our plant maturity. And think about that also when you're grazing, right? If you have a rotational grazing program, the optimum time is going to be 3.5 to 5 weeks of regrowth, right? It's going to be at the prime time to graze that forage if you're looking at getting the most out of your forage quality on your live grasses, okay? Okay, so now what? We've learned all this great stuff. We can read a forage test. We know how to get there. What do we do with that? Well, we need to match that forage quality to our animal needs. And so we need to understand our animals' nutrient requirements. And so that's the amount of nutrient that they need. And it's going to be determined by a whole bunch of things, right? Weight of the animal, sex, age, growth rate, stage of production. And that's going to be dependent on whatever kind of livestock you're feeding, okay? So our nutrient priorities run like this. And this is for most all animals. So when an animal intakes nutrients, the first thing those nutrients are going to is maintenance, right? They're going to stay alive. Their heart's going to beat, their normal bodily functions are going to happen. The second thing that's going to happen is they're going to grow. And so certainly if you're feeding a younger animal, it's going to go towards growth. The third thing is lactation, if it is lactating. The fourth is reproduction. So what happens, let's use the first calf heifer as a good example. What happens if we're feeding a first calf heifer and we're not feeding enough to meet all of these nutrient priorities? Because guess what? She's got to maintain. She is still growing because they really don't reach mature cow size until about 3 to 4 years of age. She's nursing a calf. Hopefully we've got a calf on the ground, and now we're trying to get her to rebreed. That's probably the highest nutrient required animal that we have, is the peak lactation first calf heifer, okay? Because she is put nutrients into all 4 of those things, okay? It's a lot of times why we can't get them to rebreed is because we're not meeting those needs and they're not getting all the nutrition that they need. So here's an example of some nutrient requirements broken down. Most of the time if you look at nutrient requirements, it's going to give you a chart with kind of, it might say dry cow, mid-lactation, peak lactation, or here it gives you months since calving, okay? So, and then also how big that cow is. You know, it's going to take more energy to feed a big cow. But then there you have dry matter intake, you have total digestible nutrients, and then you have this crude protein. Notice that there's not a lot of range in this crude protein. That is very easily, 9 to 11. There, 11 is as high as it goes. You don't need a whole bunch to meet their needs, okay? So, but also the thing to point out is these lactating 2-year-old heifers have higher energy requirements than those cows do, okay? And they have these broken down in charts all kinds of ways. Here's an example of one for goats. Again, you really only get into some higher crude protein levels in really high lactation or our weanlings, which are, again, are growing animals, have a little higher energy on some of those as well. Here's one for sheep. And then this one is for horses. Horses are going to look a little different. They use digestible energy and crude protein in grams rather than percentages like we do in cattle, but you can still, figure out. A forage test for horses is going to look a little different than a cattle one is as well. It'll give you these numbers so that you can match them up. Okay, so we talked about relative forage quality of different forage species, but here it kind of breaks it down as to what an animal needs, okay? So somewhere in here at about the 100 range, you have dry cows, mature horses that do light work, your 18 to 24-month-old heifer, that you're trying to get a little older heifer. When you move up further up the list, up here, is our heifer 3 to 12 months old, our weanling horse, mature horse with intermediate work, and then of course any of our dairy lactating animals up here at the top is going to have our highest RFQ need. So one way that we can visually appraise if we're meeting the needs of our animals is to body condition score. And I'm not a supreme body condition scorer by the numbers, you know, like I don't know that it exactly matches up, but you can gauge where the right spot is for your animals. So body condition scores for cattle run from 1 to 9. We want to keep them somewhere in about a 5 to a 6. 6 might even get a little fleshy for some folks. So maybe 5 is probably about the right spot. But we certainly don't want to have a Western sizzling steer, which is kind of what we're running into up here. You see, I mean, she's definitely doesn't have any flesh, right? We've definitely got chine bone, we see hip bones, we see ribs. You know, she could definitely go with a little more flesh. On the other hand, we don't want one like this Gert right here, where she is past the point, right? So that's definitely a 9. She's, you know, she's also going to have the same problems though. She's not going to rebreed. She's not going to be productive because she's carrying all of that extra condition. We can do the same thing in our other livestock. Sometimes it's a little harder to see, sometimes because of hair coats and things like that, but we can still body condition score and see how much flesh they're toting to tell if we're meeting their needs. If they're starting to lose flesh and you see bones, we are not meeting those nutrient requirements. So just to give you an idea of how important that is to keep them in the right condition. So the green line is pregnancy rate percentage. The red line is our calving interval. So you'll see when we get down here, we're really skinny, like a 3, that's getting a little thin. Our pregnancy percentage is lower, but our calving interval is higher, which means we're not producing a calf every single year. We're struggling to get those cows bred. But as we approach more in this 5 and the 6 range, it goes the direction that we want it to. And so again, this one just also emphasizes that as our body condition increases, our pregnancy percentage increases, our calving interval gets back to 365 like we want it, our weaning weights go up, etc., etc., etc. More money is hopefully what that's going to mean. So, what do we want to do? We want to develop a plan to be able to keep the right amount of nutrients in those animals. We need to assess our situation and then make sure we don't get in over our head. So understanding your production system is really, really important, and your work level. So when we were down in South Georgia, so we ran some cows down, we were around Bullitt County, and I kept arguing with my husband of why we were calving in the fall when the Bermuda grass gave out and our winter annuals weren't in, and we were feeding a crap load of hay and cottonseed to get our cows through that peak lactation period. I said, Kyle, this is stupid. We should not do this. This is just, it's counterintuitive. So therefore, we moved our calving season to about February, March. Our ryegrass was coming on strong and things just were much better, right? So we had our forage system peaking when our cows were peaking and we were not feeding as much through the wintertime. So that's what I'm talking about, matching up your forage program with what you're doing, okay? And then understand your forage system, like what pastures do you have available? What are you able to put in a rotational system or put in some annuals? And then what does your conserved forage look like? How much do you need? And there's some great math out there to figure out how much hay, you can figure out exactly how much hay you need for the winter. It doesn't take a lot of computing, even I can do it, and I don't like math too much. But you can figure it out to know so that you can either contract that or go ahead and hunt for it so that you're not scrambling towards the middle of a winter season. And then you have time to develop that economical supplement if that's what you need to do. Like if we have hay quality where we do need to continue to supplement some, we can look for some options. So Again, this comes back into play of testing your forages that you have available. So let's say I have 3 different hay cuttings. Here is the chemical analysis that I got back on those. I can strategically feed those hays to the cows that need them the most. So I take this first cutting, which you see is my best, right, at 65% TDN. I'm going to feed that to my early lactation cows, which have the highest nutritional needs. I'm going to feed this other to the late gestation, and then I'm going to save that other stuff for dry cows because they don't need so much, okay? If I didn't know this and I just started feeding, then I might be feeding this 65% TDN to my dry cows, and then they're going to get fat, and I'm going to end up having to feed these early lactation ones later on because I don't have any good things to feed them. So here's a production cycle and the nutrient requirements of those cows. So we're going to begin that at calving. You see that nutrient TDN goes up, right? That's that peak lactation I talked about. And then it starts to fall down to about weaning time, and then we fall into gestation. Well, what happens, here's our peak lactation, there's our late lactation, here's our dry cow requirements. What happens if I feed at this level? Well, then I'm overfeeding these dry cows, and I got a lot of fat ones. So I say, okay, well, I'm going to split the difference. Well, now I've got 2 groups. I'm underfeeding my peak lactations, but I'm still getting some fat cows. So it's hard to feed cattle groups that have all of these things going on at one time, which is another big reason for a controlled calving season so that everybody's in the kind of the same spot. Okay, so how much do I feed? So let's say I have, it just gives you some examples, poor, average, and excellent forage, and then what some examples would be. For those peak lactations, I'm probably going to have to supplement them some regardless, but even with our dry pregnant cows, I don't have to supplement. Our late lactation, if I have really good forage, I don't have to put anything in there.
Can you go back to that for just a second?
And those are just examples. This is going to depend on what kind of supplement you're actually using. It just gives you some relative examples. But again, peak lactation, they're going to have the highest nutritional needs of any of those.
Thank you.
Okay, so here we are back to our really good forage sample that we looked at earlier, right? 157 RFQ, 12% crude protein, 65% TDN. It even includes my nitrates down here, so it's about 1,800 nitrates, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I can feed that to whatever class of animal that I want. So here's another example. This is a peanut hay, which we got into a lot down in South Georgia. 120 RFQ, sitting at about a 98.9% TDN, so, or 58.9, do I say 99? Sorry about that. 58.9, so I might not be able to maintain peak lactation cows, but probably a late gestation would be, or late lactation would be okay. 9.4% crude protein, which is kind of low for peanut hay, but it's pretty good. All right, so let's...
Can you remind me what peak lactation period is?
It's going to be about 2 months after calving.
Thank you.
2 to 3 months. I do have a math problem to balance a horse equation. If anybody's interested, it's kind of confusing because it's a little different than what cattle look like, but we can run through an example really quickly. So here is actually a forage test that was run for horses. So Mr. Randy Proctor runs horses, and he tested his hay for that. This is a TIFT 85 Bermuda grass. It has a 131 RFQ. Notice that the stuff on the far side looks very similar. You still have ADF, NDF, lignin, crude protein, but then your energy is going to look different. So they measure that in digestible energy. That's how they compute. Instead of using a TDN percentage like we do for cattle. So, for this particular sample, a sedentary maintenance horse, so this is just a horse, a pasture horse that maybe you ride every now and then, requires 693 grams of crude protein. They're going to eat about 1.5% of their body weight, which is 8.25 kilograms. So we figure how much this hay has because it had a 10.9% crude protein. It actually has 899 grams of crude protein. So we've met that need, okay? So the same horse, though, under heavy work has a much higher protein requirement. So it depends on how much you're asking that horse to do as to how much it's going to need. So we take our digestible energy. So everything in my nutrient guide back here gave our digestible energy in megacals. But on my forage sample, it's in kilocals. So I have to do a little math. Anyway, what it comes out to is that my digestible energy in this hay is really only 8.16, but my sedentary horse requires 18.3. So I'm not meeting energy needs with this forage, even though that's a really good forage. But for a horse, they have different needs than what cattle do, and so it would not meet the needs of that particular animal. Now, if I went and tested this for same as a cattle example, it'd probably be great. We could feed it the way we wanted to, but different animal, different beast. But I guess the point being, we can still figure the same things we're doing for cattle rations for other species to be able to determine if it's meeting those needs. Okay, so putting this all together, it can be very overwhelming. There are ration balancing programs out there that can help in this process. There are some pretty complicated free ones out there online, some that you can pay a lot of money for. All of them are very confusing to me. I'm going to show you this basic balancer, or at least what it looks like. It's useful. I still get confused, but there are some great people, great minds, nutritionists that can help. So we have Dr. Lawrence Stewart and Dr. Francine Henry, both really talented ruminant nutritionists that can help us. Like if we say, okay, here's my hay sample, here's the feedstuffs I have available, what do I need to do? They can help us with that. But there is a balancer available a little. We can kind of plug stuff in and play around with it. How many of you used it very much?
So
a little.
we just use it to do basically markers, not specific.
Yep. That's kind of what I've used it for too. Like if you had a lot of ingredients or something, it's usually easier just to send that to somebody and be like, tell me what to do with it. But it can help identify some shortfalls that you might need to look at meeting those needs. Okay, a few more slides and I am done for this evening, hopefully for some questions. So I did want to mention something. I don't know what the rest of this winter looks like. I mean, we got daffodils blooming up in North Georgia. Who knows? We're probably going to have another nice cold snap. But this really came into play over Christmas, right? When it just got so blasted cold. I mean, we were feeding hay like nobody's business and putting out, feed, because what happens when it gets really, really cold is that the energy needs for those animals, for every degree below 32, it goes up by 1%. So, oh my goodness, what was it? One day it didn't even get out of the single digits.